Poetry, if you believe the poets, is synonymous with song. From the earliest times in European literature, bards speak of their poems as song. They invoke the muses to sing or inspire a song, even when it seems a bit long to sing. And this apparent indivisibility with music is shared by Semitic traditions in the Old Testament, like with the Psalms or Song of Songs. Poetry is a kind of chant in its origins, musically narrating some circumstance in a performance with instruments like our lyre. The verses rested on musical pulses rather than paper and predate literature by who knows how many centuries. Think of the Australian Indigenous people whose chants date back to time immemorial, unthinkably older than Greek civilization, where gestation stories originated through a narrated geography telling of places and the events that shaped them. At its very beginning, European literature therefore gained the happy asset of two remarkable epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, that predate literature. Scholarly opinion has long held that the Homeric epics were spun out from oral traditions that evolved to the great length and complexity that we've inherited, all without writing, but transmission from voice to ear and a formidable memory. Individual bards would build the stories in accord with the myth, using little formulae that stack upon one another to make the labour of memorisation proactive and brilliant. Each would contribute some content, and so the stock grew in a creative direction with thoughtful reflections, ruminations, atmospheric clauses, allusions, similes, sophisticated insights into a mood, as well as this sort of grand expression. An element of the creative mnemonic process is rhythm. It would be easier to commit the poem to memory and augment it if the words could be stepped out to a musical beat and that enjoins the whole body in movement in accord with the chant that the genre lays claim to. Homeric verse is written in hexameters with a lengthy emphasis at the beginning of each foot, a rhythm known as dactylic. It notionally goes dum diddy dum diddy dum diddy dum diddy dum diddy dum diddy, which is compelling and immediately reinforces the image of the poet as a kind of musician who tells a story as a song. It spells a fabulous coincidence, if you will, between word and tone, syllable and beat, where the poet infuses speech with the logic of music in a functional continuity, where sense of a cerebral kind is naturally married to sense of a corporal kind. And small wonder that it captured the imagination of littérateurs ever since. It wonderfully promotes the art of verbal expression, from the prosaic to the Olympian, where the virtue of one art is enhanced by that of the other to yield a magical amalgam, rhythmical speech that proceeds from song but that carries the images and logic of language. Other genres in ancient Greek attracted other rhythms in the beautiful arts of tragedy, the paean, victory songs, threnodies and lyric poems, eclogues and epigrams. I've always been happy to go along with this warm version of literary history. It suits me and the humanist tradition that I grew up with. It flatters the genius of metrical language with this ancestral incantation of archaic times before classical antiquity, when language and music were integral to one another. And as readers, by owning this franchise of language and music, we seem to possess rights of entry into the primitive mind of an implicit golden age, where one spoke as if one sang, and language itself was blessed with a sacred, rhapsodic unity with music. Any poet in any age can appeal to this seductive backdrop of chant, as if we can enjoy the privilege of being in touch with deep substrates of early civilization. We can make contact with a prior order of language where a priestly adept of speech, a bard, could extrapolate those layers of rich cultural significance in an aestheticized order. And it's not just that it's beautiful, but almost transcendental, where language goes beyond the random configurations of spoken sound to the organized beauty of music. This narrative of unity with music also naturalizes the conventions of Greek poetry, making them appear as if proceeding by the fateful inner logic of this literal consonance with music, a common birth, co-natured, native to culture. I wish that I could reinforce this idyll of ancient poetry. It's a brilliant conceit. It proffers such a blessed birthright to succeeding poets in any language to claim something essential in the magical agency of poetry. Everyone else uses language in an instrumental way to record or analyse or prescribe or question, answer and so on. But the poet, by analogy to ancient pre-literary custom, uses language to retrieve an uncanny overlap between sounds of a semantic kind and sounds of a purely formal kind, the abstraction of music. What a lofty autonomous calling, such a sacred pinnacle of all that you could aspire to in artistic communication. But I can't completely corroborate this happy nostalgic projection. I used to think that the metrical poetic tradition of ancient Greece was an ideal and robust system that reconciled the practical and the sacred, much as archaic temples did with their rigorous aesthetic principles derived from good engineering, but soaring into the symbolic with a sublime claim on the divine. They're both a bit inaccessible, but you can't really complain if they manage to achieve such lofty goals. And metre in poetry is just like the canon in architecture in that sense. The discipline of metrics describes the rhythmic schemes that make poems regular. And pre-modern poetry is generally regular. It's one of the defining characteristics of verse before 1900 in all the European languages, if you exclude the translated verses of the Bible, many of which were written as poems, like those Hebrew Psalms, but were translated into prose already in antiquity. In the oldest parts of the Western tradition, the metre of verse makes me think of the geometric style of Greek vases with their almost obsessively regular meanders and divisions. You feel that you're looking deeply into the basis of aesthetics and proportions, as if uncovering primordial characteristics of art and poetry that equate with music. We don't have the music, but only the verse. But still we want to know, how did it sound? How is it read? And here's the rub, because what you're going to hear can either be interpreted as a marvel or a blight. If you read Greek, something initially disconcerting arises when you first try to read an ancient verse form like dactylic hexameter. Written Greek has an unusual convenience in that it's quite phonetic and nearly every word has an accent that marks where you should put the stress. It's a great commodity of Greek still today, introduced into orthography in the Byzantine period, so you're hardly in any doubt as to how a word is pronounced. When you read a line of hexameter using the stress marks, you immediately find that the line doesn't scan at all well.
Esthon dute typo ipas epos ude telesas.
Well, I got 6 beats out of it, but they're pretty ragged, and they aren't dactylic. For centuries, students have been instructed into how to read the lines that honours their technical name, dactylic hexameter, with the dam-diddy rhythm that we know about. You have to ignore the accents and scan the line according to a system of long and short syllables. The wisdom here is that the Greeks, and later the Romans, didn't observe a system of stress, but rather they poetically understood their language as a flow of long and short syllables. So to read Greek poetry, you have to suppress the accents in your awareness. The technical name for the method is quantitative metre, because it concerns the number of syllables and the relevant time or relative time that they occupy in saying them. And already I want to be impressed, because it sounds as if you're talking about language in the terms of music. Music is all about long and short, as well as loud and soft, and high and low. Music is built as sound over time. The magic of quantitative metre literally adds up in the sense that it matches the logic of the musical intervals that it sings by. For us as readers, it's initially hard to get, because it means identifying long and short syllables rather than hitting the beat on the strength of the accents. It's not just that you can't use the accents that are written. When you found the long syllables, you don't make them louder, but just longer, approximately twice as long as the short syllables. Okay, so how do you identify which syllables are long and which are short? Well, the vowels can either be long by nature, as they say, like an omega or eta, and diphthongs are long. Or they can be long according to their position, that is, they get elongated by what's around them. For example, a vowel before two consonants is counted as long. The form of the line also dictates which have to be long. With dactylic hexameter, you know, the very first syllable always has to carry the emphasis, even if it's a short syllable by nature. And then you can more or less fill in the doubts by feeling a dactylic rhythm through the longs.
Μένει δε θεάπε λέει αδειό αχιλέος.
The metre is often impossible to read as 5 damtides and a damti at the end. Some feet are dam, where that second dam also has the value of titties, because we're dealing with syllabic length rather than stress. So you have to keep an eye out for those long syllables, not just to bear the slurry emphasis, but to fill the gaps in the rhythm just by taking a bit longer to say. So we're not dealing with dumptity, where the dum is simply louder than the titty. It's damtity, so that the dam makes an emphasis by having the length of the two short syllables. And that's how the titty part can be substituted by another dam. There's still a bit of grace in the rigid system, and I'll go into the logic of it in the next video. But it's remarkable how consistent it is, where there are relatively few breaches of the rules. Once you appreciate how it works and relinquish the expectation of an accent, you can hardly believe that something so ingenious could ever have been contrived. Much less in an age before writing, where double consonants are hard to recognise by ear, since they can't be seen on a page. And we're not talking about letters of the same kind being doubled, like a double S, which you could imagine in some way conditioning the length of a vowel, but just any two consonants in a row. How could you even conceptualise two consonants in a row, altering the length of a syllable, much less practice it consistently, when you couldn't even see them written out on vellum? How did they come up with these intuitive formulae? It's surely the eighth wonder of the ancient world, quantitative metre. It isn't just that it works, that is, it produces hexameter out of chaos, but it accords with the music that it was chanted by. How incredibly brilliant were these archaic Greeks to have come up with a system for rendering their language in regular patterns to make it song-like. rhythmically compatible with the time signature to have achieved this unity of word and music that is pressed beyond metaphor in the very lines that we're reading. Sing of the anger of Achilles. And perhaps given this marvel of speaking and thinking in a musical bind, it's easy to be blinded by science. I mean, it's phenomenal. And once you possess the power to retrace these intuitions through your own reading, when you experience the charm of making the metre in your own head, once you've been inducted into this ancient marvel, who has breath left to challenge it? You've just won yourself a franchise with the very invention of poetry as its musical root. That's the bonus of this gratifying specialist knowledge of how to scan a line of hexameter in Greek or Latin. You're initially taught how to do it because it doesn't come naturally. And then you exercise the talent with whatever latitude, as if graced with the gift of metrical prophecy, anticipating the patterns as they roll along in their heaving and sinking of regular lengths that would otherwise falter as disparate. It's satisfying to get your 6 long waves in each line, and it seems miraculous to have this metrical solution developed over centuries that resolves the apparently chaotic lumps and bumps of stresses that don't make a hexameter at all and brings them into regularity. But while we're congratulating ourselves on this special attainment and following the intimate logic of the harp-strumming bards from archaic, pre-literate times, it's important to know what we've inadvertently approved as such a sophisticated lexical musical system. We've just agreed to disregard the accents that would naturally fall on the ancient words, recorded in a way that's more or less consistent with spoken Greek today. All writers on Greek metre aver that the transition's necessary, and all students are made to agree because the accents themselves don't make happy hexameters. And so students are stumped until they're adequately educated in the quantitative system and count the syllables by length rather than give them a spoken accent according to their natural stress. But then what we've accepted is that poetic usage deliberately ignores the natural intonation of the words and imposes an artificial way of pronouncing that distorts the way the words should sound. And to illustrate this anomalous elocution, we have to think of a counterpart closer to home. What would the incongruities sound like in our own language? Because they never sound so strange in an ancient language. And so you never really have to confront what travesties are going to occur as a result of the artifice. And also because metrical scholars have mostly published before the age of video, they continue to use text, which is for the eyes and which never obliges them actually to speak and reveal the garbled way of talking that the metre imposes. And we never have to listen to its aberrations. So let me avail myself of my own voice and look, I'll just rifle some prose from an English classic and turn it into instant hexameter. So here's a passage chosen at random from Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. "Why, my dear, you must know Mrs. Long says that Netherfield is taken by a young man of large fortune from the north of England, that he came down on Monday in a chaise and four to see the place, and was so much delighted with it that he agreed with Mrs. Morris immediately that he is to take possession before Michaelmas, and some of his servants are to be in the house by the end of next week. To smooth things along, I've allowed a terminal dactyl with immediately, which departs from the Greek formula for ending a line, and there'd be a couple of similar liberties elsewhere as well. But the analogy holds in that this grotesque abuse of the English language is remarkably close to the distortions of Greek that learned grammarians have insisted upon for centuries. Even the way that the emphasis ends up being carried by articles or prepositions, which doesn't happen in natural speech, that's what sometimes occurs in reading Greek quantitative metre. The quantitative construction of ancient verse effectively asks that we read in an unnatural way, counting up syllables in semantically arbitrary batches that is foreign to the words, the sense and the cadences of the language. It's no less bizarre to read Greek verse quantitatively than to produce a monstrosity such as I've wrought with Jane Austen, with its similar enjambments posted on the whim of the break after 6 beats. And I could have wrought this violence upon anything, the American Constitution, parliamentary Hansard, or a newspaper report on coronavirus, so long as you're prepared to accept that there's nothing wrong with Netherfield instead of Netherfield, Monday instead of Monday, delighted instead of delighted, Michaelmas instead of Michaelmas. You can construct perfect hexameters in English with a robotic system. Don't worry about poetry. And that is to say, you can make a perfect hash of your language, charging articles or conjunctions with the same force and semantic value as significant verbs, nouns, adjectives, and adverbs. Obviously it's horrible in English, but classical scholars will immediately retort that I'm being mischievous in creating this caricature of their wisdom, because I'm willfully ignoring fundamental differences in language and convention. So in the following 3 videos, I'm going to examine the likely counter-arguments that might be mounted against me to defend 2 millennia of Greek scholarship. That will throw up further embarrassments in the way that we understand poetry. And so then, in the final 2 videos, I'll get on to the impact that the Greek disarray has had on subsequent poetry, which has shed rhythm to the extent that not even professional actors recite Shakespeare as iambic pentameter. The unsustainable element in the poetic tradition is a fault in the very structure of poetry as an aesthetic institution that's already apparent from the first poems that are recorded in Western culture. Those masterpieces already contain a flaw in their artifice, and this defect or fracture that I hope to show in the 6 videos would eventually become fatal. There's something odd and impractical in Greek metre, which encouraged pompous justifications that take it away from its sensual basis in performance. And so there's already a layer of mystification that sits over poetry and prepares it for the obscurities of modernism. I want to find an inroad into this larger analysis of the fragility of Western poetry through a revision of Greek metrics. My contention, to sum up, is that the prescriptions of conventional quantitative metre, despite their giddy and seductive origin in song, constitute an aesthetic that is little better than capricious. Worse, that it's led to aesthetic delusion among scholars about its poetic virtues. My purpose isn't wantonly to discredit a long and noble tradition of valuable scholarship for no reason. But the results are important for our understanding of poetry, and I sense that so many of the squabbles over Greek metre in previous centuries reflected frustrated visions of contemporaneous practice in verse. While talking of ancient metre, brilliant figures from Johann August Appel to Ulrich Wilamowitz Möllendorf voice strong opinions on the poetry of their day, or a few generations earlier. In the early 20th century, Wilamowitz-Moellendorff calls the great 18th century translator of the Iliad and Odyssey, Johann Heinrich Voss, deaf to the music of the verse, even though Goethe admired him. For me, the linguistic mess that is Greek metrics is the earliest omen for the collapse of metrical poetry in the Western tradition, to the point, as we were saying, that almost no one on the professional stage competently recites iambic pentameter. The metrical tradition is dead, but it's pointless to try to find a date where it died, because it was born dead in ancient Greece. Miraculously, it was reborn with accented metre in the Byzantine period, with wonderful poets like Romanos, who respected the natural intonation of Greek words. And in the West, it was richly brought to life from the troubadours and poets of the Middle Ages to the Renaissance and Baroque, French Classicism, English Enlightenment, German Romanticism, and, the Victorians like Christina Rossetti. But the morbidity that was installed in its historical heart would inevitably catch up with it. And so, after considering the weakness of Greek prosody and the embarrassments of defending it, I'll conclude with the catastrophic impact that the ambiguities have had on modern understandings of poetry. The whole edifice of prosody is a house without foundations, almost as if the Greeks, who'd given us such robust architecture for the temple of poetry, gave us a mere illusion of a marble sanctuary, but where the styriabate is made of widely spaced planks, and your foot will drop through the gaps just when you put your weight on it. Let's take that treacherous step in the following videos.